Thank you very much. And also thank you very much for inviting us. I'm very excited to be here just from yesterday's dinner talk and these talks I've heard so far. I'm always like, yes, that's what I'm saying, yes. And it's very inspiring to be here because usually I always have to justify and legitimize my topic. And here I feel very, I'm glad to be speaking here. And I'm grateful for Thorsten to have taken me along, who's been at, I think, four out of the 5 series so far, right? And Thorsten and I met 3 years ago at a conference and immediately sort of recognized each other as kindred spirits across the quite dry desert that is Germany in terms of queer approaches in foreign language teaching. So far, slowly things are improving. There's both our PhD projects, which have queer, mine has gender and queer approaches in foreign language teaching. There is a journal that I modestly, not very modestly, advertise here that I edited, and both our articles have queer elements in them. And we copied the worksheets. Unfortunately, the journal is in German. I have a few copies. Those of you who understand German can have one. And the worksheets are in English, which we've copied, and they're at the bottom, at the end of the line, so you can have them. And I will speak about one example, a hands-on example from this journal in a moment. And one last indication how things are improving slowly in Germany might be that like at the biggest foreign language didactics conference that will be held in October, we applied for a workshop to do a workshop on gender and queer approaches, and we actually got in. And I think it is a sign that they are slowly starting to realize that it is important, even though you cannot read it, but like here at the bottom somewhere, 11 is our group. But there has been quite a big debate as well, like in Poland, with quite some moral panic as well. But now we will, I think the discourse is slowly evolving.
Yeah.
And we're trying our best to contribute.
Yeah, we do our very best to add our little puzzle piece to queering ESOL. Yeah. Or speaking from a German context, that would be queering EFL, teaching English as a foreign language. We are basically done with the intro in our outline. I will have a look at a theoretical framework. So what does it actually mean to queer ELT? And Lotta will take up this theoretical framework and present a very practice-oriented example that she put into practice and accompanied at a school in Göttingen. So we wish to provide basically a transfer from theory to practice and show how theoretical ideas can actually materialize in the classroom. Even though our talk is called How to Queer the Classroom, which might suggest that there is a recipe that fits all contexts, we do not want to sell it as this type of recipe, but rather hope that everyone who is involved in teaching can take something from our presentation and maybe connect that to their own context and make that work in their context. So what we did is we had to look at queer first. So we tried to identify the terminology or the terminologies of queer to actually describe what queering ESOL, and now my microphone's also not working very well. So we tried to have to look at what does it actually mean when we always say queering ELT, queering ESOL, queering EFL. Because it can be quite difficult to pin down the actual meaning of queer. But it is important that we are aware of the implications that queer might have when it is about transforming and informing ELT pedagogy. So this is the theoretical framework we put forward today. This is basically inspired by previous seminar series, by looking at published literature, in particular the literature by Nelson, Norton, for example, or Pavlenko. So we asked what makes an approach to ELT actually queer, and we identified 3 lines of argumentation. The first is LGBT visibility as one component of queering ESOL. The other one is could be called critical inquiry into sexual and gender identities. And the third domain could be called reflecting on heteronormativity. And even though these boxes suggest that they can be put into clear-cut categories that don't have anything to do with each other, it must be stressed that they are all linked to each other and can be used to build up on each other, so don't see them as separate but linked. When it comes to LGBT visibility, what we did or came to our mind is that queer is often used as an umbrella term for LGBTI identities or identities that work against normative sexualities and gender constructions. And so the idea is that in the classroom we must make these identities visible. This means, first of all, acknowledging that classroom cohorts are not necessarily monosexual, and should not imagine to be so, and also giving voice to learners who identify as LGBTI or otherwise, and actually affirm their existence in the classroom. And we heard in the previous talk that if they are not given voice to and if they are silenced, this can have severe influence on their learning outcome and learning career. And this is basically a symbolic move, you could say, towards valuing LGBT learners. And this can work either as participant positionings, a term Nelson used, that's what I basically just described, or also as a subject matter, so that we do not just acknowledge LGBT learners, but also think about how we can introduce LGBTI perspectives and themes into the classroom via texts and via materials. And this is very important because we want to make sure that our learners get in touch with new experiences that kind of do not just confirm what they already know, but actually extend their experience to get to know something unknown or that has been previously other. But we also think that just the idea of increasing visibility is not enough. And there are a few problems that just focusing on visibility might bring along. The first is that we could have the danger of tokenizing, that we teach about a gay subject once and never again, so that this is the only experience that our students have. So this is something that should be avoided, and we should consider including LGBTI issues on the long run into our curricula. And there's also the danger, if we always say we queer the EFL classroom, that we actually elide difference. There is a tendency maybe to focus on lesbian and gay themes more than focusing on transgender themes. And also that within each of these neat categories, there are huge internal differences that we should also acknowledge. The second problem is that just increasing visibility does not necessarily add a layer of critique or proper engagement with sexual identity and gender identity discourses. So we think that visibility is a necessary starting point, but not the end in itself. And here we are in line with Nelson, for example, who also say that queer inquiry should be added to the EFL classroom. And here we are in line with queer theory's critical impulse to look at identities critically, to deconstruct identities, and to see how identities are made or crafted or performed in actual discourses. And this is Nelson's definition of what queer inquiry looks like. And here we can already see that this is really an active, curious, and open-ended engagement with discourses of the sexual and gender. She reads, queer inquiry means turning our attention to sexual matters, identities, norms, and relationships within everyday patterns of thinking, speaking, learning, and working, with the view to understanding the complex socio-sexual dimensions and meanings that are part of day-to-day interactions, cultural practices, and social structures. And the interesting thing about queer inquiry is that we make the exploration of genders and sexualities a very explicit component in the classroom that is actually spoken about in great detail. And just to give you one example of how queer inquiry can look like, this is one example that's on the task sheet that we won't focus on in detail about is a book that is called We Are the Youth, where US American teenagers present their non-normative sexual and gender identities in the form of queer autobiographical narratives. And if you have a look at their task sheet, you will get an impression of how queer inquiry looks like, because queer inquiry means actually turning the students' attention to how these young people actually perform their identities through language. So this would be one example of queer inquiry. And the important thing is that this is added to the LGBT visibility notion by adding this additional layer of critique and engagement.
They are also online portraits, so you don't need the book necessarily.
It's much easier accessible online, of course. And the last level of engagement or dimension is have a look at queer's best-selling invention, you could say, the concept of heteronormativity, which we are probably all familiar with. And here I wish to make 2 points. First of all, that we as ELT or EFL or whatever practitioners must be very careful not to reproduce heteronormativity in ELT as a system. And we saw a few examples from the Polish context just about half an hour ago where teachers actually actively reproduced a gender binary or a heterosexual system in their classrooms. And we also can think about Ben Goldstein's journey to the coursebook world where publishers actively prevented LGBT themes from entering the coursebook. So this is something that we should be very careful and self-reflective about. And on another level, we think that it is also important to engage our learners in critically exploring or making visible heteronormativity so that they can feel the power of this, what some research call a regulatory regime. And this is, when we look at heteronormativity from that perspective, is actually very closely linked to a queer inquiry, because this would also involve queer or critical inquiry. How can that materialize or be transferred to the classroom practice is probably one of the key questions that practicing teachers are very much concerned with. And we want to make the point that this theoretical framework can be transferred to ELT practice, and this is what Lotta will show in a few seconds. And we just want to make the point that this includes considerations of topic. So are there any topics or themes that we deal with in the classroom anyway that also allow for a queer perspective? There are actually quite a few things where a queer perspective can easily be added, and your example will illustrate that nicely. And then teachers also have to think about possible materials and text that they can bring into the classroom that allow for that critical engagement. And on another level, it's also important that we have proper teaching practice, think about methodology, so that the combination of these three, topic, material, and methodology, is like the triangle of how the classroom can be queered. And now I would like to hand over to Lotta.
Thanks. So I'll try to demonstrate these approaches Thorsten now introduced to us with a teaching unit that was part of my research. I spent a year in a class, and every once in a while with every major topic and text they had 3 or 4 90-minute sessions on gender. And this class was taught by their regular teacher, but I designed the lessons, and he was so committed and interested in it that he put it into practice, and I sat in the back and audio taped it and observed. And but more not with an ethnographic standard, more with I was trying to evaluate the tasks I had developed. And the students were aged 16, 17, learning English as a foreign language, but already quite advanced. And in this case, the unit, they had just read Romeo and Juliet, and we stayed within the framework of the topic love and relationships, and with Shakespeare. But I also added another contemporary text, a short story by Patrick Ness, to which I will get back in a moment. So the lesson has been put into practice. I have some results, sort of feedback from the students, how they reacted, very interesting conversations, but I will not go into detail on them today, but try to more show the setup of the lessons and how to put into practice these approaches. But feel free to ask me about how they reacted afterwards. And I will go back, starting with the last aspect first, reflecting on heteronormativity. The first part of the lesson was pretty much a straightforward sonnet poem analysis of Sonnet 18 by Shakespeare. which you can obviously add and work on with more creative methods and also some language support. But what interests us here now is the discussion afterwards, after the analysis, when the teacher can draw the students' attention to the identity constructions they brought to the text while discussing it. And in the poem, as in most lyrical text actually, the gender of the speaker is not specified, and nor is that of the addressee. And then, as a teacher, you could ask questions like, did the students interpret the voice of the beloved of the speaker and the beloved person as male or female, or did they leave it unspecified? Did they assume heterosexual relationships, or did homosexual readings exist too, or did they reject this because it would be too binary? And how did they anchor their assumptions in the text, in literature, didactically? And maybe did it make a difference to know the author's gender for this? When asking these questions, it's important not to expose the learners, because there is no wrong reading of this poem. Everyone can read the speech situation like they want, according to their own imagination. However, the learners can become aware of potentially existing heteronormative reading habits. In other words, we're mostly used to reading love declarations as heterosexual ones, often from a man to a woman, even if we don't identify as male or heterosexual ourselves. So such a reflection of one's own reading habits can be a first step to raising an awareness of heteronormativity, to be able to grasp something that is usually teenagers are not aware of, even though it affects them so deeply. And only after such a reflection, the teacher can then provide the information that this sonnet, which as probably most of us know, is part of the 126, I think, sonnets out of the cycle that are addressed to young men. And to introduce this information would be also already sort of increasing visibility, not by introducing new texts or materials, but by using a very canonic text that is also read in German classrooms still pretty widely, but mostly, I think, without this crucial bit of context information. Or not even context, it's part of the literary sonnet cycle text. But before turning to focusing on this as an example of raising the visibility, let's first look at how this fact has been made invisible, also not only in the classroom, but throughout the centuries, by way of what could be a queer inquiry. And for that, students are invited to explore the history of Shakespeare's reception. And I actually invited that class to the English library at the university, and we looked at the actual sources. And I will give you a brief taste of them, because many of the supposedly objective scholars did not cope very well with the fact that their admired genius was writing poetry to men, and they went to great lengths trying to explain it away by coming up with explanations like it must have been Jesus, and then the Dark Lady, the Church, or Shakespeare's son. They would prefer it, being addressed to his son than to a man, or Queen Elizabeth, or some publishers in the 17th and 18th century even took the liberty of changing some pronouns in the sonnets from male to female, or added titles. Or one of them, George Stevens, left out, when he published the complete works of Shakespeare in the 18th century, he left out the sonnets altogether, saying that the readers would not want to read this, and that it was, he had read them, or sonnet 20 specifically, with an equal mixture of disgust and indignation. And I have some more quotes up here and on the worksheet, on the one side of the worksheet, which I won't read out now. They don't need to repeat it again, even though from our perspective now, they're actually quite funny, some of them, or absurd at least. But at the same time, they demonstrate very well how queer voices are ever again silenced, repressed, or pathologized. And this is exactly what we can find out with the class. And I think that the historical and, in the German classroom, also cultural distance can help to grasp these dynamics that work in the quotes. So we inquire into the discourse in these quotes and from a distance at first. And also this sort of unwittingly satirical effects can help with that. I have to stress it's important to understand that this is not about deciding whether Shakespeare was gay or bisexual, but that it is, which, I mean, those concepts hadn't been invented at the time anyway, but that this queer inquiry aims at revealing the mechanisms of normative ideas about sexuality in the eyes of the beholders. So Shakespeare as an author can maybe only be credited for writing poetry that is as open as that. Yeah. And then the last part of the unit, the biggest part basically, is dedicated to further increase the invisibility of LGBT, but it seems important to us and to me to get there in this context of a broader approach of reflecting on norms of gender and sexuality in general in order to avoid this tendency for tokenism and so thinking that representing queer characters is important, but it's not enough just to represent them, but we should also think about the question how, and try to find ways that won't let the majority of students sort of, wave it off, maybe positively, exotically, but still as the other. So, as argued before, on the one hand, we should connect it with the general queer inquiry, and on the other hand, see how we can approach them and how students can get an inside perspective. So here, what Jason just said as well, how they can relate to characters emotionally so that our queer students, if out or not, can have characters to identify with, and the others have characters they can relate to. Because, as we know, homophobia and transphobia often stem from not knowing queer perspectives and definitely not feeling with them. And I think that this sort of empathic approach is called for here. And I always, in my thesis, and I think very well suited for that, is to work with literary texts, because they allow inside perspectives, they appeal to emotions, and plus, the students can then talk about the characters, and they do not necessarily have to talk about themselves. They can relate to it, and they can talk about themselves, but they're not forced or openly to do so. But it's still being negotiated. And the same for drama, actually, to get into the perspective of something. I also do a lot of drama pedagogical activities. So to come to the source, the other source I added, it's a short story by Patrick Ness, who some of you might know from he has a trilogy that is very widely read, I think, Knife of Never Letting Go, Chaos Walking. And this short story is collected in a collection called Losing It, about the first time from different perspectives. And it's about 4 childhood friends, boys, 15, 16 years old, who are just discovering how they desire. And there's one who's already out, pretty self-confident, a little bumpy, difficult, but confidently out, Jack. And then there's the narrator, and who has an affair with his best friend Charlie, which is secret, and they handle it very differently, and that's where the story evolves then. And then there's another guy, Freddie, who joins the old group of friends. And on the textual level, the story is very interesting because everything that is related to first sexual experiences and sexualized swear words is always blacked out by bars. And that gives a very good opportunity to talk about taboos with the students. But mostly the story is also very well written and funny and serious at the same time. And the students I work with, they could really relate to it very well. I highly recommend this story. And through the eyes of these protagonists, then, the class comes back to the question of visibility raised during the queer inquiry of the Shakespeare reception. And this time, they take a look, like a personalized, emotionally accessible look at what had been explored rather analytically until then. So what are the subjective effects, personal effects, when queer love declarations or interpretations reading them as queer are silenced or explained away? And in order to link Different for Boys and Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, the learners are asked to imagine an English lesson in which these 4 friends have to read Sonnet 18. And then also I did some sort of freeze frame character constellation to get them into the perspectives. And then they chose the character they wanted to focus on. And then there was a group puzzle, and that's the other side of your worksheet. It has the different phases, where in the first phase, they came together in groups focusing on one character, so for example, Jack, and they thought about who this character would imagine when reading Sonnet 18. So who would be the idealized love of this person? And in Jack's case, it might be Patrick Harrington, I think, the golfer, because they had been talking about it. But the students are supposed to find clues in the text that support their views. And then in the second phase, they regroup so that every group has at least one representative of each friend and get 3 different classroom scenarios, where in one, the sonnet is read and the teacher just doesn't say anything, which leads, as in actually my case, to it being read as heterosexual and just silent assumption, heteronormative assumption as usual. In the second phase, the teacher mentions it, and that it is addressed to young men. And in the third scenario, he mentions it, but then goes on to say he cannot really imagine that the great Shakespeare would write gay poetry, and he would rather imagine a woman, and probably the guys in his class too. So like an outright homophobic setting. And then for each of these 3 scenarios, the students should imagine how the character feels inside and how he behaves on the outside, because at least one of the characters is very ambivalent and acts very differently from what he feels. And then in the third phase, and I'm coming to an end, the students return to their original characters and compare the results. So they have, with every character, they have how it felt in those different classroom scenarios. And based on this group puzzle, then there is a final discussion then with the students as themselves again, discussing how LSBTI ways of life can be made a topic or should be made a topic in the, not only, but in the English classroom. And the students can then refer to their results and to their having experienced these perspectives, but also negotiate their own opinions. And they would thus negotiate a question that has been recently discussed in Germany, in Poland, pretty much everywhere, I guess, here still too, even though you have Ofsted's guidelines already, that has been discussed heatedly and mostly by concerned parents and teachers and not by the students themselves. So in this case, they would be discussing it after having just experienced such a unit, and so in a more informed way, I hope. Right, and I forgot to click on. Anyway, so this brings us back to the discussion we will also maybe continue here, and to which we would invite you or invite you after. We will discuss it tonight. So the question of not only how to increase visibility, but also the issue of visibility or not visibility and how to deal with it. Yes, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lotta, for that incredibly interesting talk. And it's a very powerful reminder, really, of the affordances of literary text for doing queer work with students. A very powerful reminder of that.
I'll pass around this.
We've got 10 minutes. So if anyone would like to ask questions, all right. Or questions for the speakers who spoke earlier. That we didn't have time for. Lotta and you want to be time for questions. So any questions? Holly, do you want to ask a question?
A really kind of trivial question. The short story you shared is different for boys. The blacked out bit. Who was doing the blacking out? Where was that blacked out? Not in the text, but to adapt it for classroom use?
No. That is part of the text. Patrick Ness wrote it like that. It's a literary device to exactly exemplify how you cannot talk and write about gay sex, and it starts out with this question: what is the first time for different for boys? How is it? What is the first time anyway? But then it sets out with these whole 4 friends, and the students I worked with, they were really interested. They were really intrigued, and I think even on the, I don't know if you can read it. It's even briefly addressed. So there's a sort of self-reference, meta-reference in the text that the protagonist, one of them says, Well, this is, okay, I cannot read it myself, but they refer to it in the beginning, they refer to it themselves. And I remember one student saying, haha, it's always fuck, ha, ha, ha. And that was already like, he never participated, he was like intrigued by that. And then later on he went on to say he was very intrigued and he liked that he could imagine what was happening for himself and it wasn't spelled out. So that was another dimension of it, but most of the others discussed it in terms of how you cannot speak about certain things and how it's tabooed. And they really like, and they got into the characters are very well drawn. They really like the characters. I think they could connect to them.
You have a question? I missed the beginning of your talk actually. What's the setting for? What setting is this being used in? This kind of work? Where are you doing this? Is it the university setting?
No, it's secondary schools. And I'm in my complete work, I'm trying to work for all grade 5 to grade 12, 13 in Germany. There's sometimes 13. But this was in a grade 11, and they were preparing their A-levels, so they were already they were quite advanced. And I was very impressed with what they said and how they were able to express it. I hadn't expected that.
Mike.
This is actually more a comment on the Polish contribution, but this thing, we can laugh about this here, but we cry about this in Poland. Wow, I thought, yes, this is very much, because we're getting an awful lot of sort of crossovers, but there's also some kind of safe space which we can talk about it, and this is not always the case, in varying degrees, as we know. So that this, to me, that was a very moving moment.
Okay, well, sorry, Lotta.
Yeah, I'm interested in more the organizational approach towards the LGBT inclusion of your research. So you were quite, you brought it into the classroom and get it discussed, but was there anything else that was done in conjunction towards, or was that just an isolated thing? Was there, because you both mentioned increasing visibility, so I can see how it's done in the classroom, but was it like an isolated incident within your institution, or was it part of a general, more kind of sort of like increasing visibility, which is part of a national curriculum?
There are some schools in Germany that have an LGBT policy in place. There's a project that is called Schools Without Homophobia, Schools of Diversity, and schools can kind of subscribe to that organization and out themselves as being supportive and LGBT aware. So some schools have that policy in place, and this makes it easier to include such lesson units over and over again on the long run. But in your context...
And on the institutional level, those moral panic discussions were triggered when two big regions, because education is regional in Germany, started legislating that it has to be a cross-curricular issue. And then the parents were alarmed, but it's still being carried through. But I think it was slowed down. But in some Länder, so in some regions, it's already established. In Berlin, it's already established. In Niedersachsen, where I'm from, this is where the discussion started. So it's depends a little. But
did you have any resistance from other members of staff, or what was the reaction from the parents and
from the church?
Yeah.
Ideology of gender issues?
No, the church doesn't play such a big role in school. I hope. Not
unless
in my
it's
experience.
a church school, but
yeah, there are a few.
Resistance from the pupils or the parents or colleagues or.
No, not. But I mean, mine was just I worked with one colleague in one class, and they were fine with it. But I don't know. I mean, they had resistances sometimes in terms of when we got deeper into the topic, obviously, or like negotiations and stereotypes coming up. But they were not like, oh, I cannot talk about this or something. No, not complete resistance.
I was thinking of Mike's question about sort of commonalities as well, because also the Polish paper talking about thinking locally, but I also noted that it seems quite different, that Jason's examples are very local, that your examples about small and also the other Chinese dance as well, whereas you draw on Shakespeare as an example. So I was thinking sort of like the local, global in examples and cultural references and histories and how we do that in the classroom and to what extent that makes a difference. That's just an open question.
foreign. It's because it's foreign language didactics, so we have to. Our official object is like English language and culture, English-speaking cultures. However, the cultural didactic also includes always like an intercultural or transcultural view, which includes a self-reflection. So by going, like thinking about how the cultural norms are constructed there, the view goes back to what is my perception of it and how am I constructing it. And that's also the official discourse in foreign language didactics. So through the other culture sort of.
And the use of literature is kind of a traditional asset of German foreign language teaching. So there are quite a few canonical texts, such as the ones by Shakespeare, but also post-colonial authors or ethnic minority authors that have recently entered the literature curriculum. And as literature is widely read in at least in advanced German EFL classes, that basically allows for the more kind of global perspective rather than localizing it, because you have to use these texts anyway, and why not querying the text that you use anyway? So you don't have to like find new texts in the first place to start with, but put that queer perspective into practice with existing literature.
And I worked with the texts that were set for the A-levels this year. And so I ended up working with a text called Accidental Billionaires, which is the novel to the film The Social Network. And it's very, very, very sexist. So it gave me a good opportunity, but I had to work with it. So then we did a lot more on gender politics then. But I don't know why they chose, I was very horrified when I first read it, that they chose this as a set text for the whole country to read. And I think it was just because it was to do with Facebook, and they thought that was close to the teenagers.
Yeah, which is relating to what the Polish person was saying earlier, like you can be very conservative with a non-sexist, it's how the teachers deals with it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Work with the sexist text and deconstruct it, yeah.
So reversed, yes.
I was really interested, so for Jason, did you deliberately choose the Hong Kong local examples?
Yeah.
Because
it's not something that we don't see every day. We see it every day. It's just around, it's just next to us. But discussing about it in English in their non-native tongue, I think, like some researchers have found, it gives them more freedom to express things they consider to be taboo in their own language. So if you can discuss it in English in another language, it gives them the room for imagination.
That's what I think.
That kind of, I think, emotional filter. I don't know.
So the fact that it's a foreign language makes it easier to reflect on these issues. Yeah.
It's like it's swearing.
Yeah, it's not as.
It doesn't have the emotional connotation.
Yeah.
If I swear in French and I swear in English, it has a different meaning. It's more powerful in your mother tongue, I feel.
Yes.
I based my work on this assumption, but in the end of the year, I asked the students, and they were not aware of this effect. They struggled a little with the foreign language, and they said, yeah, maybe you're not expected to be as fluent, so maybe it's easier to develop new ideas, but they weren't aware of this aspect, but I think still it's there. It could still be there.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Thanks again to
Thank
Lotta.
you.